So in this video, what I'll be doing is I'll be talking you through how to sketch a quadratic curve. So when asked to sketch a quadratic curve, it's really important that you don't go overboard and use a table of values. So don't create a table where you've got x and y values and you substitute it into the quadratic equation to find the respective y value, plot that way, because you won't be expected to do that. Instead, what you need to do is make sure that your sketch consists of three main parts. But before we do that, the first thing you need to do is establish what type of parabola you are actually sketching. So is it going to be a positive parabola where you've got positive x squared, so like a U shape, or is it going to be a negative parabola where it's like an N shape where you've got a negative n squared? So regardless of how complicated your quadratic equation may look, always think about the basics and try and establish what should your graph look like. Now, going back to the three main parts, and what are those three main parts? Well, the first part is working out the y-intercept. The second part is the x-intercepts. And finally, the max and minimum point. So when you're drawing your sketch, you need to make sure that you are identifying these three things either in the form of a coordinate or a mark on your axes. So as we mentioned, there are three main areas when you are sketching a quadratic. The first one being the y-intercept. Now, to find the y-intercept, all we need to do here is make x equals to 0 and solve it for y, or we can just look at the constant at the end of the equation and that's where it'll cross the y-axis. The second one is the x-intercepts. So with this now, with regards to the x-intercepts and how many times it crosses the x-axis, if it does at all, we will look at when we look at the topic of discriminants. So with the x-intercepts, you can either have no x-intercepts, one intercept, or two intercepts. 2 is probably the most common, but it is, when we move on to discriminants, you will notice that sometimes it's not always the case. And to find the max and minimum point, what we need to do is factorise a quadratic in the form of completing the square, where our max or minimum point is going to be minus ab when you factorise a quadratic in the form of x plus a squared plus b, or we might have a constant outside of that bracket if we have one where the coefficient of x squared is more than 1. So what I'm going to do is, now I've purposely picked these 4 examples, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to work through these examples with you to try and sketch what this graphs look like. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find out the 3 main areas, and then what I'll do is I will then go on and sketch it. So looking at the first one, so first things first, we know that it's going to be minus 8. So the y-intercept for this equation is going to be minus 8. Then to find the solving of this equation, what I need to do is solve it. So I can either solve it by factorising or by working out the formula. So if I had y equals x squared minus 2x minus 8, and that does actually factorise, so that becomes y equals x minus 4x plus 2. So solving that gives me x equals, if I make that equal to 0, and we rub out the y, because we've made it equal to 0, giving me an answer of 4 and minus 2. So where the x-intercepts are going to be is at minus 2 and at 4. And then factorising this using completing the square, I'm going to get x minus 1 squared minus 8 minus 1, which is minus 9, giving me a minimum value of 1 minus 9. So there we've got 1 minus 9. So that's how we filled it in. So what I can then do in terms of my sketch, just bear with me, and there is a recommended way of how we actually do sketch. Remember that the key thing is that it doesn't need to be ridiculously accurate, but what it does need to do, it does need to be relatively neat and relatively accurate. So we'll try my best working with this. That's not going to help, so let's just quickly get rid of that. Let's do this properly. So first thing I would start off with is by drawing a horizontal line, and what I'm going to do is mark the 2 points for the intercept. Now I know it's going to be a U shape because I've got a positive parabola, so this is going to be a U shape. So then I know that I'm going to have my 2 points. If I just label that there, so I've got minus 2 here and 4 here. And then what I'll do from there is then, now this could end up in a disaster, is then draw my parabola like so. Now, by doing it in this order, what I can then do is then guess whereabouts my y-axis is going to be. So if that's -2 and that's 4, I know it's going to be somewhere along this line here, which should really use a ruler. Now, a lot of areas where students are losing marks is by labelling the axes, which doesn't really come into question when you think about the main purpose of this question is for you to sketch your parabola, but you will lose a mark if you don't label your axes as well as the numbers. So then going on from here, I know that my y-intercept is going to be -8, which relatively looks accurate because it is below the x-axis, and I know that my minimum point here is at 1 -9. So as you can see, let me just make that a little bit neater because it doesn't look great. And so from this sketch, I've got 1 -9. Now you might be thinking, well, that point just seems to be, again, we're not looking at scales, we're just looking at the accurate points. And even though the scales and the labeling doesn't look great, the fact is it's a U shape and it's a clear parabola shape. I've clearly marked where it crosses the x-axis, clearly marked where it marks the y-axis, and I've marked the coordinate of the minimum point, and that should be good enough for you to get 4 marks. So if we then go on to complete the other examples that I've drawn, so let me just get rid of all of that. So moving on to the next one. So here I know I'm definitely going to get a U shape again. So looking at the y-intercept, it's going to be at -4, so that one's relatively quite easy. Now the x-intercepts for this one, so if I then go on to solve 2x squared plus 3x -4, one thing I'm going to go kind of cheat in this one because I know what this is, and this doesn't actually factorize. So what I need to do is I'd need to use the quadratic formula to solve, and what I do is I get -3 minus root 41 all over 4 and -3 plus root 41 over 4. Now in terms of where we're looking at this, I know that this is going to give me a negative value. Now square root of 41 is going to be somewhere between, as it's 41 is between 36 and 49, I know that this answer to root 41 is going to be 6 point something. And I know that this is going to be -9 over 4. So this one here is going to be -9 over 4 roughly. So there you can see that I kind of got an idea of what it should be in about. Now, rather than using the decimal equivalent, what I'm going to do is use the surd versions of those because it's a lot more accurate. And then to work out the minimum point, which again, preparing one that I've done earlier, we end up with 2x plus 3 over 4 squared minus 41 over 8. So if I just fill in this because I forgot to do it, so I've got -3 minus root 41 all over 4, and I've got -3 plus square root of 41 over 4. And looking at this, I know that my minimum point is going to be at -3/4 and -41 over 8. So -3/4 -41 over 8. So there I've got my 3 main points. So all I need to do now is go on to sketch this. So if I just get rid of all of that and drawing my axes. Now with this it's going to be more on this side. I don't know what's going on there. Like so. So first things first, let's mark our two x-intercepts. So I know that this is going to be at -3 minus root 41 over 4, and this is going to be at -3 plus root 41 all over 4. I know that the y-intercept for this is going to, so again, to draw in my parabola, like so, and labelling the axes. So I know at this point here it's going to be at -4, and I know that the y-intercept, which is going to be on the negative quadrant here, is going to be at -3/4 -41/8. And so you can see clearly there, although it's not the best parabolas, maybe that minimum point should be a little bit more on this side rather than it looking like it's exactly on the y-axis, but that would be good enough for you to get the full marks. And so then if we just get rid of all of that. So moving on to the third example, so in this case we will have a negative parabola because my x squared is negative. Substituting the values in, we get so that my y-intercept is going to be at minus, oh, wrong pen, is going to be at minus, what am I doing? Is at -24. And now with this one, here with example 3, we've got that our x-intercepts of solving this equation will give our values of 3 and 8. And our minimum value is going to be 11/2 and 25/4. So then sketching this, again, let's quickly go through it because it's getting a bit repetitive. We've got 3 and we've got 8. We've got a y-intercept of, well, let's draw this parabola here. So we know that this point here is going to be at -24, and labelling our axes, and this point here is going to be 11/2 and 25/4. Now I wouldn't risk any labelling of any other axes, that's going to be fine, because obviously if I start labelling axes in terms of numbers, it's definitely going to look wrong. This is not the best diagram, I'll admit, it's not easy drawing on the tablet. Hopefully yours will look a little bit neater, but as long as this is in the right quadrant, these look respectable, it's going to be absolutely fine. Then moving on to the last example, so just while I get rid of this. And delete. So moving on to the last example, we know that this is going to produce a positive parabola. So again, looking at a U shape. So looking with this, we know it's going to be a y-intercept of +6 because that there is our constant. Now with this particular equation, so if I then go on to solve x squared plus 2x plus 6, in which I've got x squared plus 2x plus 6 equals 0, what I will find is that it's got no solutions. So even if I use the quadratic formula, it doesn't factorise, there's no solutions to it. So what that basically means is that the parabola does not cross the y-axis, the x-axis rather. So it would, and again I'll explain to you what this is. So this basically means that it doesn't cross the x-axis. So it's got no solutions. If you type it into a calculator, it might come out with a little I if your calculator deals with imaginary numbers, but basically it's got no solutions. So here we're going to write no solutions, and we can still work out its minimum point because it's still going to be a positive parabola, so it's still going to have a minimum point in which we've got x plus 1 squared plus 6 minus 1 plus 5, so we've got a minimum point of -1 and 5. So if I just fill that in, -1 and 5. So if we have a look at what that is actually going to look like, and let me just get rid of all of that. And again, proving to be a little bit neat on this one. And like so. So I know that my minimum point is now from this, there's only a few things that I can actually label. And so from the information, because obviously I don't have a complete set of 3 numbers to work from. Now I know that this parabola is going to cross at 6, so if I just mark that as 6, and I know that the minimum point is at -1, 5. So -1 along the x-axis is going to be round about there, and 5 is going to be roughly about there. So what this will look like is it will look something like that. So here we've got no solutions, it only crosses the y-axis, so that's the only thing I need to mention, and here it's going to be -1, 5. So like I said, take a bit of care, it's not just simply drawing a U on a set of axes. It does, the minimum point, the intercepts need to be in the right locations, or at least in the right quadrant, in terms of which of the 4 sections of your axis it's going to be in. So here we've got -1, 5, so it's going to be in -1, just guessed. 5 is going to be below where I've marked the 6, and that will be absolutely fine. So don't need to draw a dot, but you can do, but you're not going to lose any marks for it. But yeah, that should be good enough for you to get the full marks. So hopefully this makes a little bit of sense in terms of sketching quadratics. And like I said, you can make up questions, have a go at a few examples, and we'll go from there.